Welcome to On the Spectrum. I'm your host, Terri Matthews, and this is the show where we like to inform you, entertain you, and yes, educate you about all things autism. We like to call it Prescription TV. Joining me today on Let's Talk is Dr. Robert Nassif, who's a psychologist, an author, and also a father of a son who's an adult on the spectrum. So Dr. Nassif and I are going to be talking about diagnosis, the question that every parent wants to know. Dr. Nassif, thank you for coming. You are such a well-renowned, respected person, and if somebody out there doesn't have your book, they need to get it. So tell me, how do you diagnose a child on the spectrum?
Well, thanks first of all. I just really appreciate the opportunity to have a voice on these issues, having been through it myself as you have. And as you know, the diagnosis of a child on the autism spectrum is often the bomb for parents. Mm-hmm. That's how people talk about it. So
it's like Hiroshima. I mean, like World War III. It's a feeling. I'm glad you said that. Let me just stop for just a second because this is a very important topic and I don't really want to rush through it. I think people out there really need to understand because when you have a kid that kind of looks normal on the outside, and I won't say kinda, but what the world perceives as normal, and you say, my kid's been diagnosed with autism, it is a bomb for a parent. And it's very hard to articulate that to other people. You know what I mean?
Oh, sure. Like your hopes and dreams just go up in smoke of like who you thought your child was going to be, who you thought you were going to be, who you thought your family was going to be. I can remember it almost like it was yesterday at times, like as you and I have this conversation. I thought my head was going to explode.
Wow.
And it's not so much getting the term, it's understanding what it means.
Okay.
It's that whole process. It's not just like somebody watched your child, interviewed you, analyzed all this information and said, voila, it's autism. Mm-hmm. But it's like, how do you make sense of this child that you love as much as life itself, and that's the same child who breathed their first breath and you held them? Mm-hmm. And this child with this invisible, yet very deep and life-altering condition. Mm-hmm.
So tell me, Dr. Nassif, especially for those individuals that are out there, some are living with children that are diagnosed, some are contemplating, is my kid on the spectrum and afraid of getting a diagnosis. What does a diagnosis look like, and what are the differences in diagnosing?
Well, what clinicians are looking at, and by clinicians, I mean pediatricians, developmental pediatricians, psychiatrists, neurologists, psychologists, are the signs and symptoms of autism, which are all observable. Mm-hmm. They're not testable by a brain scan or a blood test, but they're observable. So we're looking at the symptoms involving relating and communicating, like two domains, mm-hmm. and restricted interests and repetitive behaviors. We're looking at things in those two domains through observation and interview, and spending time with the child to do that, and spending time with the parents to understand their perspective, their observations, not just ours.
Mm-hmm. So tell me this, can anyone diagnose a child on the spectrum? I mean, I've seen this where pediatricians, in my son's case, he wasn't diagnosed by his pediatrician that not only saw him, but saw his two older siblings. He actually had to go to a developmental pediatrician. And then there are schools that are also diagnosing. I mean, some parents are concerned, like, is the school right? Are they wrong? Are they trying to put my child into a category? So tell me, what are your thoughts about that?
Those are all real, kind of complex issues in a way. Mm-hmm. So pediatricians can do this. Average pediatricians can do screening, mm-hmm. and we have really good instruments for that. The nurse practitioners can do it in their office. In just a few minutes, they can do something called the MChat. That's available online. Parents could do that themselves and see.
MChat, you guys, MChat. So online. You can ask your pediatrician about that?
Yes. Firstsigns.org has a list of developmental milestones, and mm-hmm. that's a great resource for parents as well as pediatricians in terms of what's normal, what's, sort of beyond, what's behind, and so on. So screening can definitely happen in the primary care setting. In terms of a definitive diagnosis, that's a doctoral level clinician who has training and experience with the instruments to do this. So I'm talking about developed countries, the US, the UK, Australia, Western Europe. In developing countries, Africa, Asia, the Middle East, there's not as much access, very little access to doctors. Okay. There's a small professional class. So in those countries, teachers, nurses, therapists, can be trained with instruments that they're qualified to use to do screening and diagnosis. So I think it, kind of depends where you are and the resources that are available.
So tell me this, and because, on the spectrum, we're fortunate enough to have audiences around the United States and also overseas listen to us and try to utilize some of the information that we put here on our channel to provide services at home. But now that, we're thinking about this, and as I think through this here within the United States, what is required for a child to even receive services? Because some parents say, okay, well, my son or daughter isn't speaking, but can't they still get services? Or do you recommend them having the official diagnosis of autism in order for them to receive services?
Well, they don't need the diagnosis of autism to receive services. They have to qualify, like in the US, for early intervention services, which doesn't require that more pervasive diagnosis. And there are children who aren't speaking or who have delayed or impaired speech who just need speech therapy. So now people are coming in sometimes with a child that just needs speech therapy. Mm-hmm. So nobody should hold back in terms of getting help. Now, how to access that, primary care pediatricians can, in many cases, just write a prescription for speech therapy.
And is that costly for a family to get that speech therapy?
Many insurance plans cover it. In Pennsylvania, for example, any child with a diagnosed disability, now this goes a little off of your question, but any child with a diagnosed disability qualifies for Medicaid regardless of family income and can access everything that Medicaid pays for, which is all the therapies plus behavior analysis, et cetera. Mm-hmm. But those criteria for Medicaid vary state to state. So people should contact an advocacy organization in their area to find out how to access services. So organizations like the Autism Society, Autism Speaks, et cetera.
So I think that that's interesting because, like you said, it does vary state to state. And we have a lot of families who are writing in saying, hey, this isn't covered. This is so costly for our family. If you have a child that's been diagnosed with autism, what do you recommend? Who should you tell? Should you tell other family members? Is this an internal, keep it in the house kind of thing? For us, when Jaden was diagnosed, I felt like when we did tell people, they still didn't know what autism meant. They didn't know what that meant in reference to his abilities, and it was very challenging. No one would keep him because nobody understood the language or what would come with keeping a child on the spectrum. So should you say anything? Should you not?
Sure. Well, the question is who needs to know and what do they need to know? The label itself doesn't really explain the condition.
Right.
So we have to think about the individual child, their strengths and weaknesses, what they can do, what are their challenges, mm-hmm. and the label can explain that or be a lens to understand it. Mm-hmm. So when I think about the label as the lens, mm-hmm. Autism is primarily a communication disorder. Mm-hmm. So that's an individual with kind of a cloudy lens about social interaction, mm-hmm. not understanding the other person's point of view, mm-hmm. not picking up on body language, things like that. Mm-hmm. So one way to understand it is that it's a social learning problem. That's a description, whereas autism just is a word. So describing like what it means for Jaden, which is different than what it means for my son and different from what it means for somebody's daughter, et cetera, that's what's important. And who needs to know to love him and be a support to him as he grows. So in the case, for example, of a child with very mild autism, maybe their preschool doesn't need to know, because if they know, maybe they won't want that child. So there's a lot of variation with this, and I think there's a lot of nuance, and it takes a lot of figuring out by parents who to tell, who not to, how much to tell. But generally, being open and honest about it is going to result in greater acceptance of the child, the family, and in the community as a whole.
Well, since we're talking about who to tell, would you tell your child, would you say to your child, you have autism? And when is that, if you do decide to tell, when's that appropriate time to do so?
Well, this is a little like sex.
Wow.
So, but let me just back that up a minute. Who do you want to tell your child? With the awareness of autism today, if you don't tell your child, they're going to hear this in their classroom or on the playground. People are going to say, what's wrong with you? Do you have autism? Kids are getting that question.
They are.
So who do you want to tell them? Somebody who loves them, or a random person who's just trying to understand them and may mean no harm? So I think it's imperative on parents to explain it. Now, I think you start with understanding strengths and differences.
Okay.
What's your child good at? What are your child's challenges? And you could just start there without the label. So, and children will ask, why do I have these teachers coming to my house?
Yeah, that's a good point.
So,
their kiddos are pretty smart.
Right. So, okay, I'd start with, you have a different kind of brain. It works pretty good, but you need help with this or that.
I love that you say it that way, because as an example, Jaden, he started recognizing, he's still in elementary school, he's finally going to the 6th grade, and he started noticing he goes to different classes for different things, and there are people who service him differently than they do the other kids. And once he was in his autistic support class, there were kids that had higher level of deficiencies than he did. And so he didn't want to associate himself with autism. He was very upset by it. He didn't understand, well, why can't this kid talk, or why do they have a lot more meltdowns? But he also saw that he had meltdowns. It was just this very complex thing. And then one day we had a discussion about that he was autistic, and no two autistic children are alike. And I began to show him differences, but also showed him what I would consider the blessing in those differences, right? That it's awesome that he has multiple teachers to help him in these areas and where his gifts and his talents are. And initially he did not want to go back to autism support class, but now he goes back, and he willingly goes back. And he also likes to explain what autism is. It's funny because he walks up to people and he's like, "Hi, I'm Jaden Matthews, and I'm autistic." And I'm like, you don't have to tell everybody. You don't have to tell everybody, son. But that's how he introduces himself. That's his own thing. So
Right. So I think he'll grow up well adjusted to who he is, because you've given him the language to explain himself. Now, as he gets older, he may learn something that we teach in terms of social skills, is sometimes you disclose partially, and
Yes.
sometimes you disclose fully based on what's happening and what kind of supports you need.
So help me understand this. Did you tell your son?
Well, my son's completely nonverbal still in adulthood. I mean, he certainly heard these terms his whole life, but I don't think he comprehends them in his case.
So would you, even though so in your son's case, he may not comprehend, but what about nonverbal kids who we know have a level of comprehension? Would you still share?
Sure, I would talk to them about it. I would talk to them about it at their cognitive level. In other words, at the level that they seem to understand things.
So let me say this too, because I think this is important for our parents and our viewers out there. What do you recommend, first of all, being a doctor, a psychologist, an author, raising a child that's nonverbal still as an adult? How do you cope with it as a parent? I mean, we've talked off camera, we certainly have poured ourselves into the autism community. But, I think it's important for people out there to know that you and I have had our challenges as well, right? Like, we didn't just wake up and be like, oh, this is great. I can accept it, it's fine. We've probably gone through our own hurdles. But what would you recommend parents to do to really embrace having a kid that's on the spectrum?
Wow, that's a big question. So
it's loaded.
It's very loaded. So acceptance isn't sort of one and done. It's an ongoing process. And it's that in the Serenity Prayer, and it's that with autism. So what can we change, and what do we have to let go of? Mm-hmm. And we have a duty to change the changeable. This isn't about resignation. We are always working at this, just like life itself.
I love that.
And life itself is this odyssey full of twists and turns, joys and sorrows. And life with autism is kind of that on steroids. Because you don't know what's going to happen the next day, the next minute, based on the individual profile of your child. You often don't know those things. So we're kind of rolling with this. And, sometimes the tears aren't far. Sometimes it's just happy and you're content and, things are rolling along. All these variations, but that is also life as a whole, and that is also parenting, pushing, pulling, when to let go. These are essential, human experiences, and autism's part of a broader human experience. Mm-hmm. Many of us, probably most of us, have some of these little symptoms because they're part of being human. And autism teaches us, in a way, what it means to be human. So it's really just ongoing. And the question I hear the most from parents, whether it's here, whether it's in other countries, people have the same questions I had in the mid-'80s. What caused it? Did I do something wrong? Was it the vaccines? They have all those questions. Mm-hmm. But what they really need to know, and I think your show's doing a job on this, is what can I do? That's what people really want to know. That's what will really help. Engaging their child at the table, on the floor, at mealtime, at bath time. That's the way we help our children maximize who they can be, relate and communicate more. Think about relating and communicating, because as that capacity increases, problem behaviors tend to decrease.
So as like you have all heard, relating and communicating, this is the things that you can continue to do more, especially when you have a kid that's on the spectrum. And
absolutely. I think to accept something this challenging, you leave claw marks all over it.
I love that. I got to get that into a t-shirt, doctor.
This is an excruciating process in the beginning. Not that mine was all that different from yours in terms of trying to find a cure.
Right.
Trying to just try everything. And I think parents have to try what makes sense, because at the end of the day, you have to be able to look in the mirror and know you gave this your best shot. Even if you're doing something sort of off-label, not endorsed by the medical community, you have to do whatever you have to do to be able to sleep at night and know I'm doing the best for my kid.
And I think that that's what we all want to know as parents. Thank you so much for coming on today. This is just a very big topic, especially for those that are dealing with the diagnosis, or should they get the diagnosis. I'm concerned about some of these parents who just won't get it because they don't want their kid labeled. So I want them to understand, not getting the diagnosis doesn't help either. So thank you so much for being here today and sharing this information and your personal story.
Thanks for the opportunity. I appreciate it.
So we hope during this episode of Let's Talk you found useful information. And to get more information like this or other stories, please log on to www.onthespectrum.tv. Please be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel so you don't have an opportunity to miss very, very valuable information such as this. That's all the time we have today. Thank you for joining us, and see you next time on The Spectrum. So I'm glad you're here, and I'm glad you're a voice for other people, for sure.
That's all I can do. I can't stop talking about this.
Is it your son that motivates you? What's your motivation now?
Well, my son motivates me, and it's like, I don't know, Maya Angelou has this quote about there's no worse agony than having an unwritten story inside yourself. Ooh. And so I had that feeling when I wrote my first book. It's like, this is the book I wanted to be able to read when I got the news. Mm. And that really drove me. I mean, yeah, I'm tired some days, but I mean, as long as I can do this, I'm going to be doing it. because that also heals something in my heart, to be able to give something to others. Sometimes we helping others sometimes helps ourselves. Sometimes it's the best way to help ourselves is to give to others. And I'm fortunate. I can earn a living doing this.
That is fortunate, and it's something you're passionate about.
I'm very passionate about it. I have healthy daughters. They're they've graduated college. I'm just so happy and proud and energized by their lives. And and I love my son as much as life itself. I used to dream, and in my dreams he would talk to me. And now, occasionally I dream of him, but in my dream, I know I'm dreaming and he's not talking. Wow. And that took a long time to stop dreaming that he would talk and believe that therefore he would.
Wow.
So it's kind of also a spiritual journey, this accepting
Amen.
What seems totally unacceptable. And your heart is mourning, but there's a Sufi saying that when the heart mourns for what it has lost, the soul rejoices for what it has gained.
Amen. I love that. We're going to start doing some Sufi sayings. Thank you so much for sharing. I appreciate you so much, and thank you for all the amazing work you continue to do.
Thank you. This is me. This is what I do.
Are we done crying now? Everybody on the set is gone.